Hello students, welcome to BBA 432. This is chapter 7. Today I will be talking about governmental influence on trade, specifically covering part 2. So this is part 2 of chapter 7, in which I will review the economic and non-economic rationales for trade protectionism. So we will be looking at the major forms of trade controls and trade controls effects on companies' operating decisions, right? In part 2, basically, I will be looking at the rest of trade control instruments, particularly looking at the non-tariff barriers. So in part 1 of my lecture, I covered tariff barriers, right? So we look at the tariffs, duty, taxes, and so forth and so on. But those were tariff barriers. This time we will be discussing non-tariff barriers, which includes direct price influences, right? So basically, when we talk about non-tariff barriers, we're referring to administrative regulations, policies, and procedures, such as quantitative and qualitative barriers to trade that directly or indirectly impede international trade. So one of these non-tariff barriers are subsidies, and they can also be used, these type of non-trade barriers can also be used as instruments that directly influence the prices, right? So basically, in the case of subsidies, we're really talking about direct or indirect financial assistance from governments to their domestic firms to help them overcome market imperfections and thus make them more competitive in the marketplace. Okay? So although this definition is straightforward, there is always a disagreement among scholars and economists on what constitutes a subsidy, right? Or whether or not as such subsidies cause any trade frictions within the market and between the countries. In essence, governmental subsidies can help companies be more competitive indeed. So if you look at the most competitive developing economies like South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, you will not be surprised to see that in the first stages of development, immediately after World War II, the government gave a number of subsidies to the export industries that helped them become more competitive in world markets. Okay? And today also, you will also notice agricultural subsidies being implemented within European Union's common agricultural policy. And then the second form of non-tariff barrier is aid and loans. Okay? Governments may give aid and loans to other countries, but require that the recipient country spend the funds in the donor country. So here, in the case of aid and loans, we're not talking about loans given to companies or firms. We're really specifically talking about loans and aid to other countries. But that country that is receiving the loan should spend the money in the donor country. So this concept is generally known as tied aid or tied loans, right? Tied aid or tied loans. Loans given in order to achieve a certain goal, but that loan should be spent within the country which gives the loan. So in this way, some donor products that might otherwise be non-competitive may find limited international markets, right? Let's say the US government decided to give a direct loan to the Japanese government. The Japanese government must spend the amount of the loan within the US market and by buying US products. There is also growing skepticism about, disagreement about the value and the purpose of the tied aid, especially the practicality of the tied aid because it can slow down the development of local suppliers in developing countries and shield the suppliers in the donor countries from competition. Again, some people see it's a form of unequal exchange between the country receiving the loan and the country given the loan. It kind of promotes unequal exchange because it sort of like prevents the development of local suppliers in the developing country and protect the suppliers in the donor countries from international competition and thus promoting an unequal exchange. Okay? Some people argue that, for instance, tied aid helps win large contracts for infrastructure such as telecommunications, railways, and electric power projects in the donor country. So it favors the interest of these big infrastructure businesses in the donor country. So there are other direct price influences. Other means that the countries may use to affect prices include establishing special fees for consular and customs clearance and documentation. There might be requirements that customs deposits be made in the advance of shipment and minimum price levels at which products can be sold after they receive customs clearance. One of the most popular forms of government subsidy, as I said, can be seen in the agricultural industry. From the standpoint of market efficiency, subsidies are more justifiable than tariffs because they seek to overcome rather than create market imperfections. Okay? So among the economists, in other words, always remember this debate. Subsidies are more preferable to tariffs because they're trying to overcome these market imperfections. However, some people argue that many international frictions also result from disagreements about the definition of a subsidy. So although there is little disagreement on what a subsidy is, there's a disagreement over the uses of subsidy. So for instance, agricultural subsidies, if you look at the history of the agricultural subsidies, you will see that they're very difficult to dismantle. Here, for instance, the sugar price controls in the United States. Sugar farmers, right, receive subsidy from the US government. Sugar farmers are a big lobby. Therefore, it is in the interest of the sugar farmers to keep their lobbying power by continuing to receive subsidies from the American government. Therefore, because of the power that they can generate, it is very, very difficult to get rid of or dismantle the agricultural subsidies. So the one area in which everyone agrees that subsidies exist is the agriculture, especially in developed countries. So the official reason is that the food supplies are too critical to be left to market. Okay? So therefore it is in the interest of the government and also it is in the interest of the public, so to speak, to protect the agricultural industry because these food supplies are too critical to be left to chance. Although subsidies lead to surplus production, like overproduction of sugar, overproduction of farming goods, they are argued to be preferable to the risk of food shortages. So in the name of protecting the public interest, sometimes governments find it justifiable, and most of the time, governments find it justifiable to continue to give subsidies to the agricultural industry. So let's look at the learning objective 4, describe the major instruments of trade control. Again, we continue our discussion in describing the uses and the limits of these trade controls, continuing with the non-tariff barriers. This time we will be looking at the quantity controls. Quantity controls can be in the form of various trade instruments, the first one being a quota, right? Quota is different than a tariff because a tariff was always established as a percentage of the value of the item being imported. In the case of the quota, quota is a quantity limit because it limits the quantity of the product that can be imported or exported in a given time frame, typically per year, right? So it limits the quantity of the product, exported or imported. Import quotas normally raise the prices because they limit the supply of the foreign goods entering the local markets, right? And the difference will be paid by the consumers. Consumers will end up paying higher prices for the foreign goods. Therefore, import quotas in principle normally raise the prices because they limit the supplies. They also provide little incentive to use price competition to increase the sales. Okay? A specific type of quota that prohibits all trade is called an embargo, right? For instance, the United States, after the revolution on Cuba, imposed embargo on the trade between the United States and Cuba, which meant that the Cuban goods could not enter the US borders. Okay? So this was embargo is a specific type of quota because it prohibits all trade with another country. Right now we have an embargo with Iran, right? Iran is another example of the US embargo on US trade with Iran. So we do not export any goods to Iran, we do not import any goods from Iran. Okay? There is no export-import relationship in the case of embargo. As with quotas, a country or group of countries may also place embargoes on either imports or exports on particular products regardless of origin or destination, on specific products with certain countries, or on all products with given countries. Countries may decide to get together within the UN and decide to establish or impose an embargo on another country that violate international norms when it comes to human rights, when it comes to proper ways of engaging in international trade, and so forth and so on. So United Nations or countries within the United Nations may act collectively to impose embargo on other countries that violate the principles of international trade or international order. And the second type of quota is also known as voluntary export restraints. Okay, voluntary export restraints, known as VERS. These are called voluntary because these restraints are imposed voluntarily. They are, in other words, negotiated. Those voluntary export restraints are negotiated limitations of export from one country to another. And as in the case of quota, it may also result in higher prices to customers. Let's assume that, for instance, Japan and the United States voluntarily agree to limit the export of Japanese cars to the United States. So this is a voluntary agreement. And Japan accepts to limit its exports of cars to the US markets. Okay? Other non-tariff barriers can be by local legislation. Sets the rules whereby governments give preference to domestic production in their purchases. There are also standards and labels, like countries can devise classification, labeling, testing standards to allow the sale of domestic products while obstructing foreign trade ones. And then there might be specific permission requirements, right? Countries may require that importers or exporters secure governmental permission, like an import or an export license, before transacting trade. There might be administrative delays, right? Closely similar to specific permission requirements are, for instance, administrative custom delays that might be caused by intention or inefficiency, okay? However, because of the competitive pressures and the market dynamics, many countries may be motivated to improve inefficient administrative systems. So in other words, these administrative delays, in other words, are always in the nature of the system. And sometimes these administrative delays happens because of the inefficiency in the customs. Okay? So there can also be like reciprocal requirements. Governments may require that foreign suppliers accept products in lieu of money. Okay? So governments in different parts of the world may require that foreign suppliers accept products instead of or in lieu of money. So there might be offsets and counter trade, right? Offsets and counter trade are reciprocal requirements that are made between countries with ample access to foreign currency that want to secure jobs or technology as part of the transaction. And then let's look at the service industry specifically, okay? Because another instrument of trade control is or includes the restrictions imposed on the service industries. Indeed, I mean, if you look at the service industry, it is the fastest growing sector in international trade, and the governments prefer to impose restrictions on the flight of services. Countries restrict trade in services, for instance, such as transportation, insurance, advertising, consulting, and banking. In deciding whether to restrict service trade, countries typically consider 4 factors. Okay, so these are some of the factors that motivate countries to impose these restrictions, such as essentiality, not-for-profit services, standards, and immigration. So what is the essentiality argument? I mean, essentiality argument is proposed to justify these kind of restrictions, right? Sometimes you will see the governments prohibiting private companies, foreign or domestic, from operating in some sectors because they feel the services are essential and provide social and political stability. In other cases, they set price controls or subsidize, for instance, government-owned enterprises that create disincentives for foreign private participation. Some essential services in which foreign multinational firms might be excluded from investing in the local economies are media, communications, banking, utilities, and domestic transportation. So you would not be surprised to see in these industries with very limited foreign participation in the name of protecting the public interest or in the name of protecting essential enterprises, such as government-sponsored enterprises. The second justification is not-for-profit services, right? Mail, education, and hospital health services are often considered not-for-profit sectors in some countries, right? This is certainly not the case for healthcare in the United States because, you know, hospitals are profit-making enterprises. Almost all the hospitals in the United States are private enterprises, right? So they are not necessarily considered as not-for-profit sectors of the economy. But in many developing nations, you would not be surprised to see the health services are often considered as being non-profit enterprises in which only few foreign firms can operate. When a government privatizes these industries, it customarily prefers local ownership and control. And the third justification is standards, right? Standards, we will be looking at some of the standards here. Sorry. Some of the standards here, basically, standard is another justification given to promote some of these instruments of trade control. For in the case of the standards, for instance, some services require face-to-face communication and interaction between the professionals and the clients. And governments sometimes limit entry into many of them because they want to ensure practice by qualified personnel. One of the examples for the standard argument is the licensing requirements. The licensing requirements include such professionals as accountants, architects, electricians, engineers, hairstylists, lawyers, medical personnel, real estate brokers, teachers. And then finally, we have the immigration factor that can be used as a justification for imposing the restrictions on service industries. Satisfying the standards of a particular country is no guarantee that a foreigner can then work easily there. In addition, governmental regulations often require an organization, domestic or foreign, to search extensively for qualified personnel locally first, before it can even apply for work permits for personnel it would like to bring in from abroad. So basically, here we're really talking about another justification is the threat from import competition. Right? There is another justification, which is the threat for import competition. Which is basically the fact that some of the companies may indeed be threatened by import competition from abroad, right? So when companies are threatened by competition from foreign countries' producers, right, they have several options to consider. Although there are risks and costs associated with each options, firms can still deal with trade restrictions by either moving operations to a lower cost country, right? Or concentrating on market niches that attract less international competition, or adopting international innovations that lead to greater efficiency or superior products. Okay? Or some of them try to get governmental protection if they're losing their market because of the competition from abroad. So there are different ways of dealing with the threats from competition from other companies. Okay? So there are some tactics and techniques for dealing with import competition. Okay? When the options of moving operations abroad, concentrating on niches and innovations fail, or they are not practical, let's assume that these three options fail or they are not necessarily practical, companies will this time directly turn to government to restrict imports or open export markets, right? So it is in the interest of the companies at this point to convince the politicians, meaning the decision makers, right? So companies may want to find governmental officials who are supportive of their cases. Generally, Congress is sensitive to the employment effects of trade, especially in their jurisdictions. And of course, the companies need to involve the industry and the stakeholders. Okay? There is strength in numbers, and companies will want to join the forces within the industry to gain more political support. Outside groups such as activists and the general public may be of help in promoting the case for favorable trade policies for the firm. Okay? Sometimes firms prepare for changes in the competitive environment. They do not particularly seek any assistance. It's just that they prepare very wisely for some of the changes in the environment. Companies can take different approaches to deal with changes in the international competition environment. Frequently, these different approaches are based on the strategies, abilities, and the strengths of each company. Again, always think about this question. Which do you think is the best option for companies to effectively deal with competition from abroad? Should they be, negotiating those trade instruments with the government? Should they be moving operations to another country? Should they concentrate on their market niches that attract less international competition? Or should they try to get governmental protection? I think each case is different and each solution has its own advantages and disadvantages. So I think the option that they are seeking to protect themselves depend on the industry itself. Some industries heavily rely on governmental support. Some industries heavily rely on market. Some industries are more regulated. Some industries are less regulated. I think whether or not the companies can effectively deal with international competition depends on the type of industry we are talking about. Again, as we have seen in this chapter, the international regulatory situation is in many ways becoming very complex. While some groups and firms are pushing for free market, others demand greater protectionism. Thus, it is likely that as barriers come down for some products in some countries, those barriers may go up for other products in other countries. I mean, this is the reality of international trade. Our world trade is becoming more and more globalized, and the barriers have been removed, and the markets have been deregulated. But again, you will see that those barriers come down for some products in some countries. However, you will not be surprised to see that some of those barriers increase for certain products in other countries. So overall, we also suggested that you really need to look at the issue of stakeholders before imposing trade barriers. Especially stakeholder is very important in governmental trade policy, because trade policy is the one that is the most politicized and that is subject to diverse political influences, whose interests should be of paramount concern. So who are those stakeholders? We're really talking about producers, consumers, and the government. Producers, consumers, and the government. Can, let's say, sanctions by a single nation against another be truly effective? Or should it be multilateral? Or if not, a unilateral action? Okay? Can one country impose an embargo on the other? Should this decision be multilateral, meaning that should this decision be made by taking the approval of other countries, right? Or should this decision be unilateral? Okay, so these are the type of issues that we're interested in analyzing for a better understanding of the implications of trade controls for companies. Hopefully, I was able to teach you the concepts and tools that will help you answer these questions and gain a better perspective on the effects of governmental intervention in international trade. Thank you for listening to my lecture so far. Again, this lecture was about part 2 of chapter 7, and I will see you guys in the next chapter, which will be the chapter 8. See you next time. Have a good day. Bye-bye.